Hi guys, and welcome to America History Tales. Tonight we drift slowly across a grey Atlantic morning, the air thick with mist and coal smoke, as a ship carrying hundreds of tired travellers creeps toward the harbour of New York. You stand at the rail among them, hands wrapped around cold metal, your knuckles pale from the chill and from the quiet tension that has followed you for weeks. The water is calmer now, and somewhere ahead through the fog lies the country you have imagined during long nights below deck. America. The word has floated through crowded villages and cramped city apartments back in Europe for years, whispered like a promise. But standing here now with damp wind brushing your face and gulls circling above the ship, the promise feels less like a dream and more like a test. You lean forward, squinting through the haze. Somewhere ahead the harbour is waiting. You probably will not survive this moment with your nerves intact. After all, a single inspection on a small island can decide whether you begin a new life or turn right back around across the ocean. Not exactly relaxing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, feel free to share where you are listening from and what your local time is. It is always fascinating to see how far these quiet nighttime stories travel. Now dim the lights. The ship slides forward with slow determination, its engines humming softly beneath your feet. Around you, passengers press against the railings. Some clutch small bags, others hold children wrapped in blankets. A few simply stare ahead in silence, as if afraid that blinking might make the vision disappear. Then someone points. Through the thinning fog, a tall shape rises from the harbour. A torch glows faintly above a green figure standing proud against the pale sky. The Statue of Liberty. This moment became one of the most widely remembered scenes in immigrant memory. Many newcomers arriving in New York Harbour between the late 19th and early 20th century caught their first clear sight of America through this towering statue. It had been standing there since 1886, greeting ships like an enormous, somewhat stoic lighthouse of hope. The deck suddenly stirs with movement. Voices ripple through the crowd in Italian, Polish, German, Yiddish, Greek, and languages you cannot even identify. Someone begins to cry quietly. A man removes his hat and holds it against his chest. You watch the statue grow clearer as the ship glides closer. The torch lifts high above the water, glowing softly in the morning haze. For many travellers, this figure represents freedom from war, famine, or political oppression. For others, it simply means work. Honest work that might feed a family. You inhale deeply. The air smells different here. Less of open ocean, more of coal smoke, river mud, and distant industry. America has a smell already, and it is busy. Behind you, someone whispers a prayer. Immigrants often carried small objects across the ocean as tokens of luck. A medal of a saint, a family photograph, a piece of cloth from home. One curious anecdote recorded in passenger accounts describes travellers bringing soil from their homeland in tiny cloth bags. The idea was simple. If they died in America, at least they would still rest with a piece of home. Comforting in a slightly dramatic way. The ship groans gently as it turns deeper into the harbour. Buildings begin to appear along the shoreline. Tall warehouses, brick factories, smokestacks puffing steady columns of grey into the sky. Compared to the villages many immigrants came from, the scale of New York feels enormous and noisy. Even from this distance, you can hear faint whistles and clanging metal from the docks. You shift your weight and glance toward the lower decks where steerage passengers have spent most of the voyage. Weeks ago, you boarded with hope and fear tangled together. The Atlantic crossing has not been gentle. The steerage compartments were crowded, and the air below deck often smelled of damp wood salt and hundreds of tired bodies trying to sleep. Some people spent much of the voyage seasick. Others passed time singing, arguing, or speculating endlessly about what would happen at Ellis Island, because that island is where you are going next. The ship itself will not dock there. Large vessels usually stop at the Manhattan piers, but steerage passengers are transferred to smaller ferries or barges and carried across the harbour to a modest island where immigration officials inspect every newcomer. Ellis Island. At its peak, this small processing centre handled thousands of arrivals per day. On the busiest days, more than 10,000 immigrants could pass through the system. You watch as Manhattan grows larger to the south. The skyline is not yet the forest of skyscrapers we know today, but the buildings are still impressive. Tall brick structures line the waterfront and church spires poke above the rooftops. You hear someone nearby speaking in halting English. "Practicing. What work you do," the man says quietly to himself. "Carpenter." He repeats it again, adjusting the words. Immigrants knew they would face questions from officials. Simple questions perhaps, but nerve-wracking when your future depends on answering clearly. How much money do you have? Where will you live? Do you have work waiting? A wrong answer or even hesitation could raise suspicion. You glance toward a young family nearby. The mother is smoothing her daughter's hair while the father studies a folded paper again and again. It is likely an address. Perhaps a brother waiting somewhere in the city, or a cousin who arrived years earlier and wrote back with promises of opportunity. Family networks played a major role in immigration during this period. Many newcomers did not arrive blindly. Relatives often sponsored or guided their journey, creating small chains of migration from specific European villages to particular American neighbourhoods. You might soon join one of those chains yourself. The ship's horn blasts suddenly long and low. Everyone startles slightly. Ahead, a small island appears in the harbour, topped with red brick buildings and towers. It does not look especially grand. In fact, it resembles a busy train station more than a gateway to a nation. That is Ellis Island. The ferry docks, the inspections, the questions, the doctors, the waiting halls. All of it lies ahead. Scholars continue to debate exactly how stressful this moment felt for most immigrants. Some historians argue that processing at Ellis Island was surprisingly efficient, with the majority of arrivals passing through within a few hours. Others emphasise the intense anxiety recorded in diaries and letters suggesting that even a brief inspection could feel overwhelming when the stakes were so high. You shift your bag on your shoulder and watch the island slowly grow larger. The sun is rising now, burning away the last of the fog. Light glints across the harbour water. Seagulls drift overhead, occasionally diving towards scraps tossed from the ship. Your heart beats a little faster. After weeks of ocean, America is no longer an idea, it is a place. And in just a short while, you will step onto a small island where strangers will decide whether you belong. The ship begins to slow. Voices rise again around you, filled with excitement, worry, and the strange, quiet courage that has carried everyone across an entire ocean. You take one last deep breath of the harbour air. Ahead waits Ellis Island, and your new life is about to begin its very first test. The ship settles into the harbour with a long, tired sigh of metal and steam. Ropes are thrown toward the dock, sailors shout instructions, and the vessel finally comes to rest after weeks of rolling Atlantic waves. For you and the other steerage passengers, however, this is not quite the end of the journey. In fact, it feels like the real beginning. You wait along the lower decks where the steerage passengers have been gathered. The space smells faintly of damp wood, sea salt, and wool clothing that has not seen proper washing in many days. The air is warmer here than outside, thick with nervous breath and murmured conversations. Someone nearby laughs too loudly, the kind of laughter people use when they are trying to hide how worried they really feel. Your bunk from the voyage still sits behind you. It is little more than a narrow wooden shelf with a thin mattress stuffed with coarse straw. During the crossing, you learn to sleep despite the constant creaking of the ship and the restless shifting of dozens of strangers packed into the same compartment. This cramped lower deck area was called steerage, and it was the cheapest way to cross the Atlantic. Steamship companies often filled these spaces with hundreds of passengers. Privacy was almost non-existent. Families sometimes slept in rows separated only by thin partitions or hanging cloth. The air during the journey could become stale, especially during storms when hatches were closed. You remember one night when the waves were so rough that buckets slid across the floor and passengers clung to their bunks while the ship pitched violently. Seasickness spread quickly through the compartment, turning the atmosphere sour and miserable. And yet, despite all that, people still managed moments of humour. A curious detail from passenger diaries describes how some immigrants passed time by inventing small games. One popular pastime involved guessing which passenger would become the richest in America. The guesses were rarely serious, but the idea itself carried hope. Anyone here might become someone new. You glance around now at the same faces you have seen for weeks. The Polish farmer who snores like a train engine. The young Italian couple who whisper together late into the night. The elderly woman who spends hours quietly fingering a small rosary. Soon a crewman appears at the top of the stairwell and shouts instructions. Steerage passengers will be transferred first. A murmur runs through the room. People begin collecting their belongings. The amount each person carries is surprisingly small. A cloth bundle, a wooden trunk, a battered suitcase tied with rope. Some immigrants arrive with almost nothing beyond the clothes they are wearing and a few coins sewn carefully into their coats. You lift your own bag. It feels heavier now than when the journey began, though nothing new has been added. Perhaps the weight comes from what lies ahead. The line begins to move slowly up the stairs. As you step onto the deck again, sunlight greets you with a brightness that almost makes you blink. The harbour looks calmer than before. Tugboats puff steadily through the water, guiding larger ships toward the docks. You catch another glimpse of the Statue of Liberty in the distance, its copper surface glowing faintly green in the morning light. Many immigrants describe this moment vividly in letters home. The statue seemed less enormous up close than people imagined, but its meaning felt powerful all the same. It stood there quietly holding its torch as if patiently waiting for each new arrival. Your attention soon shifts to the water beside the ship. Several smaller ferries have pulled alongside. These vessels will carry steerage passengers across the harbour to Ellis Island. The process is carefully organised because the immigration station cannot handle an entire ocean liner's passengers at once. You shuffle forward with the others. Dock workers help guide people down narrow gangways onto the waiting ferries. The boards creak under the combined weight of hundreds of travellers moving cautiously across them. A small child ahead of you pauses halfway down the ramp, staring wide-eyed at the water below. His mother gently nudges him forward. The ferry deck fills quickly. There are no comfortable seats, just open space and wooden benches. People stand shoulder to shoulder, clutching luggage and children. The boat pushes away from the ship with a soft churn of water. You feel the motion immediately. After weeks at sea, the smaller ferry feels oddly stable, yet your body still sways slightly with imaginary waves. As the ferry glides through the harbour, Ellis Island grows larger ahead. The main building rises from the island in red brick and pale stone, topped with towers and wide windows. Smoke curls from chimneys. From a distance, it resembles a grand railway terminal more than an immigration checkpoint, which is fitting. In many ways, this place functions like a giant sorting station for human journeys. Between 1892 and 1924, more than 12 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island. Most were processed quickly and allowed to continue into the United States. Only a small percentage were denied entry. Even so, the possibility of rejection weighs heavily on everyone here. You notice how quiet the ferry has become. The earlier chatter fades into low murmurs. People watch the island approach with intense concentration, as if studying every brick might somehow reveal what will happen next. A man beside you pulls out a small folded photograph. Two children stare back from the worn paper. He studies it carefully, then slips it back into his coat. Nearby, a teenage girl practices English words under her breath. Work, she whispers. Factory. Sewing. Translation often becomes a lifeline on Ellis Island. Interpreters speaking dozens of languages assist immigration officials during inspections. Without them, the process would collapse into chaos. Still, misunderstandings are common. Scholars continue discussing how language barriers shaped immigrant experiences during inspection. Some researchers suggest interpreters helped smooth most interactions. Others believe confusion sometimes caused unnecessary detentions when officials misread an answer or an accent. The ferry bumps gently against the Ellis Island dock. The sound echoes across the water like a quiet drumbeat. Dock workers tie thick ropes to iron posts. The gangway is lowered. Suddenly everything feels real. People shift nervously, adjusting hats, smoothing coats, lifting children into their arms. A few passengers cross themselves, others simply stare ahead. You step forward with the crowd as the line begins to move again. The wooden planks of the dock creak beneath your feet. This small island, only a few acres wide, now holds your entire future. Beyond the dock, you see the entrance building waiting with its tall arched doorway. Officials stand nearby, directing passengers toward the next stage of processing. Your heart begins to beat faster. The Atlantic is behind you. Ellis Island stands directly ahead. And in just a few minutes, you will walk through those doors and into the crowded halls, where your new life will either begin or quietly pause. The ferry behind you rocks gently against the dock. The line moves forward, step by step, closer to the entrance, closer to the moment when strangers will decide what happens next. The line moves slowly along the wooden dock, each step bringing you closer to the tall brick building waiting ahead. The ferry behind you bumps gently against the pier, its engine ticking as it cools, while another ferry approaches from the harbour, carrying yet another group of arrivals. Ellis Island rarely rests for long. You adjust the strap of your bag and step forward again. The dock feels solid beneath your feet, far steadier than the rolling deck of the ship. After weeks at sea, that simple stability feels strangely comforting. Still, your stomach carries a nervous flutter that has nothing to do with ocean waves. Ahead, immigration officials gesture calmly, directing everyone toward the entrance. A tall arched doorway opens into the main building. Its brick walls glow warmly in the morning light, but the doorway itself looks darker inside, like the mouth of a tunnel. The moment you cross that threshold, the real process begins. You pass through the doorway with dozens of others. Inside, the air changes immediately. It smells faintly of soap, damp coats, and something metallic from the building's pipes and railings. Your footsteps echo across the tiled floor as the line continues forward. Voices bounce around the walls in dozens of languages, blending together into a soft roar of human sound. This building was designed to move people efficiently through a series of inspections. Engineers and architects built it to handle enormous crowds without descending into complete chaos. Even so, chaos occasionally found its way inside anyway. You follow the line toward a staircase that curves upward toward the second floor. A guard stands nearby watching patiently as families and travellers climb the steps with their bundles and trunks. Up you go. Your legs feel slightly stiff after the voyage, but the climb is not long. As you reach the top of the stairs, the space ahead opens suddenly into something far larger than you expected. The registry room. The ceiling stretches high above you, supported by steel beams and wide arched windows that flood the room with daylight. The floor spreads out like an enormous hall, filled with rows of railings that guide the movement of immigrants through the inspection process. Hundreds of people already fill the room, perhaps thousands. Some stand quietly in line, others sit on benches holding children or luggage. Officials move briskly between groups, their uniforms adding small islands of order in the sea of humanity. You pause for just a moment, taking it all in. The noise here is remarkable. Footsteps, conversations, babies crying, officials calling instructions. The sounds swirl together beneath the vaulted ceiling, creating a constant hum that almost vibrates in the air. It feels less like a welcoming hall and more like the busy interior of a railway station, where every traveller is waiting for a train that may or may not arrive. A guard waves your group toward one of the long metal railings. You join the line again. The railings guide everyone through a winding path that leads gradually across the hall toward a row of inspection desks. The system resembles a maze, but it keeps the crowd moving steadily forward. Immigration officers observe the lines carefully. Their job is not only to process paperwork, but also to watch the immigrants themselves. Inspectors look for signs of illness, confusion, or anything unusual that might require closer attention. A widely accepted historical detail is that most immigrants spent only a few hours in this hall before receiving permission to enter the United States. The system was designed to move quickly. In many cases, the entire process could be completed in less than half a day. Yet for those standing in line, every minute stretches long. You feel it now. Your eyes drift across the room. Families huddle together for comfort. A young boy swings his legs from a bench, clearly bored after the long voyage. A man nearby stares at the floor as if mentally rehearsing answers to questions he expects to hear soon. Someone sneezes. Several heads turn immediately. Health inspections are one of the first steps immigrants must pass through, and even a small sign of illness can lead to further examination. Doctors move quietly along the lines, watching for symptoms. Their inspections happen quickly, sometimes only a few seconds per person. Still, those few seconds carry enormous weight. You notice small chalk marks on the coats of some immigrants ahead in line. Letters and symbols appear briefly on their clothing before attendants guide them towards separate areas of the hall. These marks signal that a doctor has noticed something worth investigating further. Perhaps a cough, perhaps eye irritation, perhaps simple exhaustion. A lesser-known anecdote, recorded in several immigrant memoirs, describes how some travellers became deeply anxious about those chalk marks. One story tells of a man frantically wiping his coat with a handkerchief after receiving a symbol he did not understand, hoping to erase whatever judgment had been written there. Of course, the officials noticed immediately. The man was sent for further inspection anyway. You shift slightly in line, glancing towards the tall windows along the wall. Through the glass, you can see the harbour sparkling under the midday sun. Boats move lazily across the water, and Manhattan's buildings rise in the distance, like a promise just out of reach. For now, though, the only thing that matters is this hall. Historians continue to discuss how immigrants emotionally experience this space. Some scholars portray the registry room as a symbol of hopeful arrival, a place where dreams finally passed into reality. Others emphasize the intense uncertainty felt by newcomers who stood beneath this ceiling, wondering whether they would be accepted or rejected. Perhaps both views are true. You step forward again, closer now to the inspection desks. An official nearby calls out instructions in English, then repeats them through an interpreter who translates quickly into several languages. The system tries to keep everyone informed, though confusion still flickers across many faces. You hear fragments of conversation around you. Questions about jobs. Questions about relatives waiting in the city. Questions about money. Many immigrants carry only a few dollars. Officials want to know whether newcomers will become dependent on public support. If someone cannot demonstrate the ability to work or provide for themselves, the inspectors may hesitate. The line inches forward. Your turn approaches. You feel your heart thumping quietly in your chest as you reach the final stretch of railing leading toward the desks. Ahead, an inspector lifts his head and gestures for the next person to step forward. You inhale slowly. The registry room hums with activity around you, and in just a moment the questions will begin. The inspector lifts his hand and gestures toward you. You step forward from the railing and approach the desk, your shoes tapping softly against the tiled floor. The sound disappears quickly into the constant murmur filling the registry room. All around you the hall continues its restless motion. Lines shuffle forward. Officials lean over paperwork. Interpreters glide between languages with practiced ease. But for this brief moment, your world shrinks to the small wooden desk in front of you. The inspector glances up. He studies your face for a second, not unkindly, but with the calm concentration of someone who has repeated this task thousands of times. A ledger lies open before him. Beside it sits a passenger manifest brought from the ship, a long list of names written carefully before the voyage even began. Immigration officers rely heavily on these documents. Steamship companies were required to record detailed information about every passenger before departure. Names, ages, occupations, hometowns, destinations in America. By the time you stand here, the officials already know much about you. Their questions simply confirm whether the story still holds together. He asks the first question, your name. You answer clearly. The inspector runs a finger down the manifest until he finds it. The line of ink representing you among hundreds of other travellers. Another question follows, your age, then your occupation. A clerk nearby scribbles small notes while the inspector listens. The process moves briskly. These officials must process enormous numbers of immigrants each day, so efficiency matters. Records from the early 20th century show that experienced inspectors could often complete these brief interviews in less than a minute, when everything seemed straightforward. Still, each question feels heavier than it should. Your destination in America. You provide the address carefully. Perhaps a cousin in Brooklyn. Perhaps a friend who wrote promising letters from Chicago. Many immigrants arrive with these addresses folded safely in pockets or tucked into prayer books. Family connections played a powerful role in shaping immigration patterns. Entire neighborhoods in American cities sometimes grew from the arrival of people from the same villages across the Atlantic. The inspector nods slightly and continues. Do you have work waiting? You explain as best you can. Maybe you know a factory foreman. Maybe a relative promised to help you find employment. Work is the foundation of the immigrant dream, and officials want reassurance that you will not struggle without support. Your accent thickens slightly under the pressure. Fortunately, an interpreter stands nearby. He listens carefully, then repeats your answer in clear English for the inspector. Ellis Island employed interpreters who collectively spoke dozens of languages. Without them, the inspection lines would have slowed to a crawl. Still, misunderstandings sometimes slip through. One unusual story preserved in immigration records tells of a traveller whose occupation was mistranslated so badly that officials briefly believed he was a circus performer. In reality, he had simply been a village carpenter. The confusion was eventually sorted out, but the moment must have been memorable. The inspector asks how much money you carry. You answer honestly. Immigration law required newcomers to show that they could support themselves, at least temporarily. The exact amount varied, but having a small reserve of cash reassured officials that you would not immediately fall into hardship. You reach into your coat pocket and briefly show the folded bills or coins you carry. The inspector glances at them and nods again. Then comes a quieter question. Have you ever been in prison? You shake your head. Have you ever been in an almshouse or supported by charity? Again, no. The questions might feel blunt, but they reflect the immigration policies of the era. The United States wanted labourers and workers, but officials also feared admitting people who might require public assistance. Researchers studying these interviews often note how quickly inspectors learned to judge a person's confidence. Clear answers and steady eye contact often helped smooth the process. You try to appear calm. Your heart, however, beats like a drum. The inspector flips one page of the manifest. He studies the information for another moment. Nearby, you hear another interview taking place. A woman answers questions while holding a sleeping child. An elderly man speaks through an interpreter, explaining that he will join his sons who arrived 2 years earlier. Voices overlap across the hall, each conversation carrying its own quiet tension. The inspector returns his attention to you. One final question. Are you meeting someone here? You nod and explain who will greet you once you leave the island. Many immigrants were met by family members waiting across the harbour. Some even arranged to send telegrams announcing their arrival as soon as the ship reached port. The inspector seems satisfied. He makes a small mark beside your name. For a moment, nothing happens. Then he gestures gently towards the next railing. You may proceed. Relief washes over you like warm sunlight. This stage of the inspection is complete. Most immigrants pass through Ellis Island without serious difficulty. Government statistics suggest that the majority were approved for entry after only brief questioning and a quick medical check. Still, not everyone moved forward so easily. Some passengers were directed toward additional examination rooms if inspectors noticed inconsistencies or concerns. Those individuals waited in separate areas while officials investigated further. You glance toward one corner of the hall where a small group sits quietly on benches. Their expressions reveal a different story. Immigration historians often discuss how emotionally intense these waiting periods could become. For families separated during additional inspections, even a few hours felt agonizing. Fortunately, your path continues forward. You step through the railing and join a new stream of immigrants moving toward the next stage of processing. Behind you, another traveller steps up to the desk. The questions begin again. Name, age, occupation. The rhythm of the hall continues steady and relentless. You walk slowly across the wide floor of the registry room, passing beneath the tall windows that flood the space with afternoon light. Dust floats lazily through the beams of sunlight. Outside the harbour glitters beyond the glass. For the first time since arriving, you allow yourself a small breath of relief. One gate has opened, but Ellis Island still has several more waiting ahead. And just beyond those gates lies the mainland of America, humming with possibility. You move forward with the small cluster of immigrants who have just finished their first round of questions. The inspector behind you already calls the next person forward, his voice blending back into the steady rhythm of the hall. For him, the work continues without pause. For you, however, each step now feels lighter. Still, Ellis Island is not finished with you yet. The railings guide you toward another line that curves across the far side of the registry room. A sign above the corridor points toward the medical inspection area. Even though you passed the first brief observations while standing in line, doctors now examine immigrants more closely before granting final entry. You join the line again. Around you, people shift quietly, some relieved, others clearly nervous. The hall smells faintly of disinfectant and damp coats. The large windows along the walls let in generous light, but the atmosphere still carries a sense of quiet scrutiny. A young man ahead of you rubs his hands together repeatedly. His sister whispers something reassuring in their language. Behind you, an older traveller clears his throat and immediately glances around as if worried someone might notice. Medical inspection was a central part of the Ellis Island process. Immigration authorities believed certain diseases could spread quickly in crowded cities, so doctors watched carefully for symptoms among arriving passengers. Records from the Immigration Service show that physicians developed extremely rapid examination techniques. Some doctors became so skilled that they could scan a person's posture, eyes and skin in just a few seconds. The line inches forward. You begin to see the doctors more clearly now. Several physicians in white coats stand beside a narrow passage where immigrants pass one by one. Their movements are quick but deliberate. One doctor lifts a passenger's eyelids briefly with a small button-hook tool. Another studies someone's breathing and posture as they walk past. The moment feels unsettling, yet it is remarkably efficient. The eye examination you see is specifically meant to detect trachoma, an infectious eye disease that worried immigration officials at the time. If doctors suspected its presence, the immigrant would be sent for further medical evaluation. The thought crosses your mind that the entire future of a traveller might hinge on a doctor's glance, lasting only a few seconds. You try not to think about that too much. Your turn approaches. A physician gestures for you to step forward. You walk slowly past him while he studies your face, your eyes, the way you move. The inspection is quick. His hand briefly lifts your eyelid to check for irritation or swelling. Then it is finished. He nods once and waves you onward. You almost laugh from the sudden relief. The entire examination lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Most immigrants experienced something similar. Contemporary reports suggest that only a small fraction of arrivals were held for more detailed medical checks. For the majority, the process moved quickly. Even so, the tension in this line remains very real. You notice a woman a few places behind you being gently pulled aside by an attendant after a doctor pauses longer than usual during her examination. The attendant speaks softly to her and guides her toward another corridor. Her husband stands frozen for a moment before following. No one nearby says anything. Stories from immigrants sometimes mention how frightening these moments could feel. Families worried that a simple illness might separate them from loved ones, or delay their entry into the country they had travelled so far to reach. A curious little observation from one diary, written by an immigrant in 1907, describes how people waiting in line tried to blink normally during the eye exam, fearing that even blinking the wrong way might cause suspicion. Human nerves have a way of inventing strange worries. You continue walking along the corridor that leads away from the doctor's station. The path curves back into the wide registry room again, where attendants guide you toward another checkpoint. The railings funnel travellers toward a desk where officials stamp landing cards and confirm that each stage of inspection has been completed. You hand over the small card you received earlier. The clerk studies it, marks the paper with a quick stamp and returns it to you. The sound of the stamp echoes softly across the counter. Approved for the next step. You tuck the card carefully into your coat pocket. Around you, the steady flow of immigrants continues. Some move quickly now, sensing that the hardest parts may already be behind them. Others still glance anxiously toward every official they pass. Researchers studying Ellis Island have long examined how remarkably organised the process became by the early 20th century. The system had evolved through years of experience, gradually improving its speed and structure as immigration numbers increased. Still, interpretation of the island's atmosphere varies widely among historians. Some scholars portray Ellis Island as a fairly smooth and humane gateway, where most immigrants experienced brief inconvenience before moving on with their lives. Other researchers emphasize the emotional intensity of the experience, arguing that even efficient processing could feel overwhelming for newcomers who had risked everything to reach this point. As you move through the hall, you can understand both perspectives. The process works, yet every person here carries their entire future in a small bag. You reach the end of another railing where attendants direct you toward a final waiting area. Wooden benches fill the space, and a few immigrants sit quietly while clerks organise paperwork for the next stage of departure. You lower yourself onto one of the benches for a moment. Your legs feel surprisingly tired, not from distance, but from tension slowly draining away. Through the tall windows nearby you can see Manhattan rising across the water. The city looks close enough to touch now. Ferry boats move steadily between the island and the mainland, carrying those who have completed the process. Soon you may board one of those ferries. Soon you may step onto American soil for the first time outside this island. You rest your hands on your bag and breathe slowly. Around you the hall continues its endless motion. Doctors examining eyes, inspectors asking questions, families waiting, hope and uncertainty moving together through the same long lines. Ellis Island is not simply a building. It is a moment suspended between two lives, and you are almost ready to step through it. You remain seated on the wooden bench for a few minutes, your bag resting between your boots. The bench is smooth from years of use, its surface worn by thousands of travellers who sat here before you, each one caught in the same quiet pause between inspection and departure. Around you the waiting area hums softly with movement. A clerk carries a stack of papers across the room. Two interpreters speak rapidly with a nervous family who cannot quite understand the instructions being given. A child nearby swings his feet back and forth beneath the bench while his mother watches the doorway anxiously. You glance toward the harbour through the tall windows. Manhattan waits across the water, so close now. Yet a few final steps remain before you reach it. After a short while, an attendant steps into the waiting area and calls out several names from a small list. Each name echoes across the benches with varying degrees of confidence, depending on how comfortable the attendant feels pronouncing unfamiliar syllables. You listen carefully. Soon your name is called. You rise quickly and approach the desk. The clerk sits behind a stack of documents that appear both carefully organised and slightly chaotic at the same time. He flips through several sheets before locating the one he needs. The manifest from the ship sits nearby, and beside it lies the record card that has followed you through each stage of the inspection process. He studies the paperwork briefly. Then he asks you a few final questions. They are similar to the ones you answered earlier, though slightly more precise. Officials sometimes repeated certain questions to confirm that immigrants were consistent in their responses. If someone gave conflicting answers about their destination or occupation, inspectors might pause the process for further review. Your destination in America. You repeat the address. The clerk nods. He asks whether you are meeting a relative or friend once you leave the island. You answer again. The process feels almost routine now. Your voice comes more easily this time, the nervous tightness from earlier beginning to fade. The clerk makes several quick notes and compares your answers with the manifest from the ship. Immigration officials relied heavily on those passenger manifests. Steamship companies were legally responsible for recording accurate information before passengers departed Europe. If serious errors appeared in the documents, the shipping company could face fines. This system encouraged companies to screen passengers carefully before allowing them aboard. Still, mistakes occasionally slip through. One rather amusing incident recorded in immigration reports tells of a traveller whose hometown was accidentally written as the name of a nearby river. For a short time, officials attempted to locate the mysterious village that apparently existed somewhere along the water. Eventually the misunderstanding was sorted out, though the clerks must have enjoyed the puzzle. The clerk before you finishes reviewing the paperwork. He places a small stamp on one of the documents and presses it firmly against the page. The sharp sound echoes softly in the quiet office space behind the desk. Approved. You feel a wave of relief that seems to begin somewhere deep in your chest. The clerk slides the document aside and points toward another doorway leading down a short hallway. Ferry to the city, he says simply. That is all. No ceremony, no grand declaration. Just a quiet instruction pointing toward the next step. You thank him and move toward the hallway with a few other immigrants who have completed the same stage of processing. The corridor slopes gently downward. Your footsteps echo lightly against the tiled floor as you walk. The air here smells faintly of damp stone and the harbour beyond the walls. At the end of the corridor, another attendant stands beside a wide exit door. He gestures toward the dock outside. The moment arrives almost quietly. You step through the doorway and feel the cool harbour breeze brush against your face. The air outside is fresh after the warm interior of the building. Sunlight reflects brightly off the water, making you squint for a moment. Ahead, several ferries wait at the docks. These boats carry newly admitted immigrants across the short stretch of water separating Ellis Island from Manhattan. Dock workers move efficiently along the pier, guiding small groups of passengers toward the appropriate vessels. Some immigrants head toward ferries bound for the mainland. Others board trains waiting at the island's railway connections, which send travellers deeper into the country almost immediately. Transportation from Ellis Island was carefully organised because immigrants arrived from many different destinations. Some were heading only a few blocks into New York City, others planned to travel hundreds of miles inland to cities like Chicago, Pittsburgh or St. Louis. The United States stretched far beyond the harbour you see now. Researchers studying immigration patterns often note how quickly many newcomers move beyond New York after arrival. The harbour served as a gateway, but the immigrant story unfolded across factories, farms, and neighbourhoods throughout the nation. You step onto the wooden dock. The boards creak beneath your weight. A ferry captain calls instructions to his crew while passengers begin boarding. The vessel rocks gently against the pier, its ropes pulling taut against iron posts as waves nudge the hull. Nearby, a young boy points excitedly toward the skyline of Manhattan. The city rises proudly beyond the water. Tall buildings catch the afternoon light, their windows flashing like small mirrors. Smoke curls from factory chimneys. Ferries and tugboats crisscross the harbour in every direction. It looks enormous and loud. You pause for a moment before boarding your ferry. Behind you, Ellis Island stands quietly with its brick walls and tall windows. From this angle, it looks less intimidating than it did earlier, almost peaceful. Yet you know the tension contained inside those halls. The questions, the doctors, the waiting. For millions of immigrants, this island served as the narrow doorway between the life they left behind and the uncertain promise ahead. Some historians describe Ellis Island as a symbol of opportunity. Others focus on the fear and scrutiny embedded in its procedures. Both views capture part of the truth. Standing here now, you simply feel tired and hopeful at the same time. A deckhand waves you forward. You step across the gangway and onto the ferry. The boat rocks slightly beneath your feet as other passengers gather along the railings. Some hold their luggage tightly. Others gaze silently toward Manhattan as if trying to memorize every detail of the skyline. The engine rumbles softly to life. Soon the ferry will push away from the dock. Soon Ellis Island will shrink behind you, and the vast, unpredictable life of America will begin unfolding just across the harbour. The ferry shudders gently as its engine begins to turn the propeller beneath the water. A low vibration hums through the wooden deck beneath your boots, steady and reassuring, like the deep breathing of a large animal finally waking from sleep. A deckhand unties the thick rope from the dock post. The ferry drifts outward from Ellis Island. You instinctively step toward the railing, joining several other passengers who want one last look at the island that has just examined their lives so carefully. Behind you, the red brick buildings grow slowly smaller. The tall windows of the registry room catch the afternoon light glowing softly as if nothing extraordinary has ever happened inside them. Yet you know better now. Inside those walls, thousands of questions echo every day. Doctors lean close to inspect tired eyes. Clerks flip through endless pages of manifests. Interpreters jump from one language to another like careful acrobats. And travellers from across the world pass through the same narrow system, each hoping for the same quiet stamp of approval. The ferry moves steadily across the harbour. The wind feels stronger out on the open water. It carries the scent of salt coal smoke and the distant smell of the city itself. Somewhere nearby, a tugboat releases a short, sharp whistle that echoes across the water. You grip the railing and look ahead. Manhattan rises across the harbour like a wall of stone and glass. At the start of the 20th century, the city was already growing rapidly. Immigration fueled its expansion, filling factories, workshops, and construction crews with new workers eager to build lives in the United States. Observers at the time often remarked how quickly newcomers became part of the city's daily rhythm. Within days of arriving, many immigrants found themselves working long hours in garment factories, bakeries, construction sites, and shipyards. Opportunity existed here, but so did exhaustion. You notice the skyline more carefully now. Church towers rise beside warehouses. Smokestacks punctuate the sky. Along the waterfront, enormous piers stretch into the harbour, where cargo ships unload goods from every corner of the world. It is a city built on motion. The ferry deck grows more animated as passengers begin pointing toward landmarks. Some immigrants recognise buildings described in letters sent by relatives who arrived years earlier. Battery. Someone whispers near you, identifying the southern tip of Manhattan, where many ferries arrive. A man beside you pulls a folded letter from his coat pocket. The paper looks worn from repeated reading. He studies the words again, likely reviewing the directions he will follow once he steps onto the city streets. Addresses written in careful script, street names that still feel foreign on the tongue. Small instructions meant to guide him through a place he has never seen. The ferry rocks gently as it cuts across the harbour waves. Nearby, two women speak quietly in Italian. They discuss where they will sleep tonight. One mentions a cousin who lives in a crowded apartment in the Lower East Side. The other plans to stay at a boarding house run by people from her hometown. Immigrant neighbourhoods often formed quickly as newcomers sought familiar languages and customs in the unfamiliar city. In New York, entire streets sometimes filled with families from the same regions of Europe. Researchers studying urban life during this era frequently point out how these ethnic communities helped new arrivals adjust to American life. Shared food, shared churches, and shared traditions offered comfort during the first difficult years. Still, not everyone agreed on whether these tight communities slowed or strengthened assimilation into American society. Some scholars argue that ethnic neighbourhoods provided essential support networks. Others believe they delayed cultural integration. The debate continues even today. A sudden gust of wind flutters your coat. You glance back toward Ellis Island again. From this distance, it already looks smaller. The buildings appear quiet now, almost peaceful. Ferries continue arriving and departing, but the island itself feels far away from the intensity you experienced inside its halls. One charming little story preserved in the memories of immigrants describes how some travellers wave goodbye to Ellis Island as if it were a person rather than a place. After passing inspection, they felt grateful to leave, but oddly respectful of the island that had tested them. You understand that feeling. The ferry pushes forward. The sounds of the city grow clearer, metal clanging somewhere along the docks, voices drifting across the water, the faint rumble of trains running along elevated tracks further inland. For many immigrants, this was the first glimpse of American urban life. The scale of the city could feel overwhelming compared with the villages and small towns many travellers had left behind. Rows of tall buildings stretch across the shoreline. Horse-drawn wagons roll along the streets near the docks. Small crowds gather along the waterfront waiting for arriving ferries. Your ferry slows slightly as it approaches the Manhattan Pier. Deckhands move quickly along the ropes, preparing for docking. Passengers begin collecting their bags and bundles, suddenly aware that another important moment is about to arrive. You pick up your own bag. The leather handle feels familiar in your hand after weeks of travel. For a brief second you close your eyes and listen. The ferry engine humming, the slap of water against the hull, the distant sounds of the city waiting ahead. Immigration records from the early 20th century suggest that most newcomers stepped onto the mainland with little ceremony. There were no welcoming bands or grand speeches waiting at the docks, just the city, busy, loud, indifferent, yet full of possibility. You open your eyes again. The ferry glides closer to the pier. A deckhand throws a rope toward a dock worker who catches it easily and loops it around a heavy iron post. The boat bumps gently against the wooden pier with a soft thud. The gangway is lowered. Passengers begin stepping forward. Some move quickly, eager to begin their new lives. Others pause at the railing for one last look at the harbour behind them. You take that final look as well. Ellis Island stands quietly in the distance. The Atlantic Ocean stretches far beyond it, invisible but immense. Everything behind you belongs to another chapter now. You step toward the gangway. Your boots touch the wooden planks of the Manhattan dock. And just like that, the vast story of immigrant life in America begins its next page. Your boots land firmly on the wooden planks of the Manhattan dock, and for a brief second you pause. The ferry rocks gently behind you as other passengers continue stepping onto the pier, but you remain still, just long enough to absorb the feeling beneath your feet. Solid ground, not the rolling deck of a ship, not the inspection floors of Ellis Island. This is the mainland of America. The dock stretches wide before you, crowded with movement. Dock workers haul crates toward nearby warehouses. Horses stamp impatiently while wagons wait to be loaded. A line of porters pushes handcarts piled high with luggage and cargo from arriving ferries. Everything seems to move at once. The air carries the mixed scents of the harbour. Salt water, coal smoke, fish, tar from the wooden piers. Somewhere nearby, someone is roasting chestnuts, the warm smell drifting across the busy waterfront. You shift your bag on your shoulder and begin walking with the other immigrants toward the end of the pier. No official greets you here. No uniformed inspector waits with more questions. The moment you stepped off the ferry, the formal immigration process quietly ended. From this point forward, you are simply another person entering the city. Government immigration reports from the early 20th century reveal that the vast majority of immigrants left Ellis Island within the same day they arrived. Once their paperwork was completed, they moved directly into the city or continued travelling toward other destinations across the country. For many newcomers, however, the city itself became the next challenge. The street at the end of the pier bursts with noise. Horse-drawn wagons rattle across uneven cobblestones. Street vendors shout offers of food and newspapers. Electric streetcars hum along rails further down the avenue. Overhead, elevated trains rumble along iron tracks, their wheels clattering loudly against the metal structure. You stop again for a moment. The sound alone is astonishing. Back home, The loudest noises may have been church bells, farm animals, or the occasional cart rolling through a village square. Here the city produces an endless orchestra of mechanical motion. A man near you laughs softly. "America loud," he says to his companion in heavily accented English. He is not wrong. You move slowly with the crowd toward the sidewalk. Some immigrants seem confident, striding forward with clear purpose. Others pause frequently, turning in small circles as they try to make sense of the streets around them. Many newcomers arrived with detailed instructions written in letters from relatives. Which ferry to take, which street to follow, which building to find. Without those directions, the city could feel overwhelming. A young woman ahead of you unfolds a sheet of paper and studies it carefully. Her finger traces a line of writing as she whispers the name of a street, trying to pronounce the unfamiliar syllables correctly. Nearby, a man in a dark coat calls out loudly in several languages. Lodging, clean beds, good price. Boarding house operators often waited near ferry docks, hoping to attract newly arrived immigrants who needed a place to sleep. Some of these establishments were honest and helpful. Others charged high prices for very crowded rooms. Travellers quickly learned to rely on recommendations from friends or relatives whenever possible. You step onto the sidewalk at last. The city rises around you in every direction. Tall brick buildings lean close over the narrow streets. Storefront windows display shoes, clothing tools, and fresh bread. Signs written in English cover many buildings, though you also notice familiar languages painted across shop windows. German, Italian, Yiddish. Entire neighbourhoods formed where immigrants from the same regions settled close together. These communities often recreated small pieces of the old world within the new city. In the Lower East Side, for example, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe built neighbourhoods filled with bakeries, synagogues and newspapers printed in Yiddish. Italian families created streets lined with groceries, selling familiar cheeses and cured meats. Such enclaves offered comfort during the difficult first years of adjustment. Yet historians examining these communities still discuss their broader impact. Some researchers argue that immigrant neighbourhoods helped preserve cultural traditions, while newcomers adapted to American life. Others believe the dense clustering sometimes slowed social mobility by limiting interactions with the wider city. As you walk slowly down the street, you begin to notice something else. Faces. So many different faces. Men with thick moustaches speaking languages you cannot identify. Women carrying baskets of vegetables through crowded markets. Children darting between wagons while laughing loudly. The city seems to contain the entire world at once. A curious detail recorded in several immigrant memoirs describes how newcomers often felt dizzy during their first walk through New York. Not from illness, but from the overwhelming combination of noise, movement, and unfamiliar sights. You understand that sensation perfectly. A street vendor passes you pushing a cart stacked with pretzels. Steam rises from a small metal container, keeping them warm. The smell is tempting after the long voyage. You realize suddenly that you are hungry. Food on the ship was simple and repetitive. Bread, soup, perhaps a little meat if the weather remained calm enough for cooking. Fresh food now seems wonderfully appealing. The vendor catches your glance and lifts one pretzel slightly. You consider it, but first you must find your destination. You reach into your coat pocket and unfold the address you carried across the ocean. The paper has softened along its creases from repeated handling. You read the name carefully. The street lies somewhere deeper in the city. You look up again, studying the signs along the avenue. Streetcars rattle past, carrying passengers toward distant neighbourhoods. Policemen direct traffic at busy intersections. Shopkeepers sweep the sidewalks in front of their stores. Life here moves quickly. faster than the quiet rhythm of the harbour you left behind only minutes ago. A passing man notices you studying the address and offers brief directions in accented but friendly English. His instructions point you toward a street just a few blocks away. You thank him and continue walking. Your steps feel uncertain at first, but gradually a small sense of confidence begins to grow. The buildings still loom tall. The streets still roar with noise, yet each block becomes slightly easier to navigate. You are learning the city already. Behind you, the harbour remains hidden by rows of buildings. Ellis Island sits quietly out there in the water. The Atlantic stretches beyond it like a memory fading slowly into the past. Ahead lies the enormous, unpredictable city where your new life will begin. And with every step along these crowded sidewalks, America starts to feel a little more real. You walk carefully along the busy street, your eyes drifting from storefront to storefront, while you try to follow the directions the passerby gave you. The paper with the address remains folded in your hand, slightly damp from your grip. Every few steps, you glance down at it again, repeating the street name quietly in your mind. The city presses in around you. A wagon rattles past, loaded with barrels. Two boys chase each other across the sidewalk, laughing loudly, while their mother calls after them in a language that sounds vaguely familiar, but not quite the same as your own. Somewhere down the block, a piano plays through an open window, the melody drifting faintly above the clatter of wheels and voices. You continue forward. The buildings here stand close together, 5 or 6 stories tall. Their brick walls darkened by years of smoke from nearby factories and coal stoves. Laundry hangs from lines stretched between windows. White shirts and dresses sway gently in the afternoon breeze, like quiet flags of everyday life. You pass a bakery where the warm scent of fresh bread pours through the open doorway. Inside, several men in flour-covered aprons pull long loaves from a brick oven. A small crowd has gathered outside, waiting for the next batch. Food shops like this became an essential part of immigrant neighbourhoods. New arrivals often sought the tastes of home while adjusting to unfamiliar surroundings. Bakeries, butcher shops and small groceries helped recreate familiar comforts within the fast-moving city. You turn the corner described in your directions. The street here feels slightly narrower though, just as lively. Small signs hang above many doorways advertising tailoring, shoemaking and sewing services. These trades offered work for thousands of immigrants who arrived with practical skills learned back home. Industrial growth in American cities created enormous demand for labour during the early 20th century. Factories needed workers for garment production, metalworking, construction, and dozens of other trades. For immigrants willing to work long hours, opportunities often appeared quickly. Of course, the work itself could be exhausting. Many factory labourers spent 10 or 12 hours each day operating sewing machines or assembling products on crowded workshop floors. Wages were modest, yet they offered something vital to newcomers: a beginning. You pause at the edge of a busy intersection while a horse-drawn streetcar clatters past on metal rails. Sparks flicker briefly from the overhead electric wires as the car continues down the avenue. A policeman stands nearby directing traffic with calm authority. The scene feels almost theatrical in its motion. Wagons crossing in one direction, pedestrians weaving carefully between them, street vendors calling out offers of fruit newspapers or roasted nuts. Somewhere above the street, an elevated train roars past its iron structure, rattling loudly as the cars race along the tracks. The sound makes several pedestrians glance upward instinctively. Transportation in New York expanded rapidly during this period. Elevated railways and streetcars allowed workers to travel between neighbourhoods and factories across the growing city. Many immigrants relied on these systems to reach jobs located far from their homes. You continue walking once the street clears. The building numbers begin to match the address in your hand. Soon you find yourself standing in front of a narrow brick building with a small wooden sign hanging beside the door. The name painted on the sign matches the one written in your letter. You have arrived. For a moment you simply stand there studying the building. The windows are open and voices drift faintly down from the upper floors. The smell of cooking onions and garlic floats through the stairwell door, blending with the city air outside. This must be the place. Boarding houses like this one became common throughout immigrant neighbourhoods. They offered temporary lodging for newcomers who needed time to find steady work or permanent housing. Rooms were often shared among several people, sometimes strangers, who happened to come from the same region of Europe. Privacy was limited, but companionship could ease the loneliness of arriving in a new country. You push open the door and step inside. The stairwell is narrow and dim, lit by a small window halfway up the wall. Wooden steps creak softly beneath your weight as you climb toward the second floor, where the letter instructed you to go. The hallway above buzzes with quiet activity. Someone laughs from behind one door. A radio or phonograph plays faint music from another room. The smell of soup drifting through the corridor makes your stomach rumble again. You knock gently on the door with the correct number. For a moment nothing happens. Then the door swings open. A familiar face appears. Your cousin, or perhaps a friend from your hometown who arrived months or years earlier. His expression breaks into a wide smile of recognition. "You made it," he says warmly. Relief washes over you once more. He pulls you inside the room where several other men sit around a small table finishing their evening meal. The room is modest but welcoming. Beds line one wall. A small stove warms the space near the window. A pot of soup simmers gently. Letters sent by earlier immigrants often described these first gatherings after arrival. Shared meals helped newcomers settle their nerves after the long journey and the tense hours at Ellis Island. Stories of the voyage were exchanged. Advice about jobs and neighbourhoods passed around the table. You place your bag beside one of the beds and sit down. The chair feels wonderfully solid after so much travel. Your cousin pours you a bowl of soup and slides it across the table. Steam rises from the bowl, carrying the comforting smell of vegetables and broth. Outside, the city continues its restless movement. Wagons rumble along the street. Voices drift through the open window. Somewhere nearby, a street musician plays a lively tune on a violin. Inside this small room, however, the atmosphere feels calmer. You take your first spoonful of soup. Warmth spreads through your chest. For the first time since boarding the ship weeks ago, you feel something close to peace. Ellis Island is behind you. The ocean lies far away. And tonight, in this crowded little room, high above a noisy New York street, your new life in America quietly begins. The small room settles into a gentle rhythm as the evening begins to gather outside the window. The soup warms your stomach while quiet conversation drifts around the table. Your cousin leans back in his chair, studying you with the kind of calm curiosity reserved for someone who remembers exactly what your journey must have felt like. "You look tired," he says with a small smile. You laugh softly. That might be the simplest truth anyone has spoken all day. Weeks at sea hours of inspections, and now the overwhelming noise of New York, have drained nearly every ounce of energy from your body. Yet beneath that exhaustion lives something else as well, a steady pulse of excitement, a feeling that the enormous machine of the city is already beginning to pull you into its motion. Your cousin pours himself another cup of tea. Around the table, the other men begin sharing stories about their own arrivals months earlier. One describes how he wandered through the city for half a day before finding the correct boarding house. Another recalls getting lost among the maze of streets near the docks. He laughs as he tells it. I asked 5 people before someone understood my accent. Moments like this were common among newcomers. Personal accounts written by immigrants often describe those early days as confusing but strangely exhilarating. The city felt enormous and unpredictable, yet every street corner carried the possibility of opportunity. Your cousin gestures toward the narrow bed beside the wall. You stay here tonight, he says. Tomorrow we find work. The words sound simple, yet they carry enormous meaning. Finding work was the immediate priority for nearly every immigrant who arrived in New York during this period. Rent needed to be paid. Food needed to be bought. Letters home needed to include good news. Factory employment became one of the most common paths forward. Clothing factories, especially garment workshops, employed thousands of immigrants across Manhattan and Brooklyn. Sewing machines clattered day and night inside crowded loft buildings where workers stitched coats, shirts and dresses for the growing American market. Observers writing about city life at the time frequently noted how entire industries depended heavily on immigrant labour. Without these workers, many factories would have struggled to keep pace with demand. The man seated across the table wipes his mouth with a napkin and begins describing his job at a garment shop only a few blocks away. 12 hours some days, he says, shrugging slightly, but the pay is better than home. You nod quietly. The thought of long factory hours does not frighten you as much as it might have weeks ago, after the uncertainty of the ocean voyage and the tension of Ellis Island. The idea of steady work feels reassuring. Even difficult work. Your cousin stands and moves toward the small window overlooking the street. Outside evening has transformed the neighbourhood into something slightly softer than the busy afternoon you first encountered. Gas lamps glow along the sidewalks. Shopkeepers pull down shutters across their storefronts. The rumble of wagons continues, though the traffic seems calmer now. Children chase each other along the sidewalk while their parents call them inside for supper. You notice the mixture of languages drifting upward through the window. Italian voices from one doorway, German from another. A pair of women speaking Yiddish as they carry groceries into a nearby building. The neighbourhood truly feels like a crossroads of the world. Historians studying immigrant districts often describe them as cultural mosaics, where traditions from many countries overlapped within just a few city blocks. Food, music, and religious customs travelled across oceans alongside the people who practiced them. Yet these communities also faced enormous challenges. Overcrowding quickly became one of the most serious problems in immigrant neighbourhoods. Tenement buildings filled rapidly as new arrivals searched for affordable housing near factories and docks. City housing reports from the early 20th century reveal that some apartments designed for one family eventually held 3 or 4 families at once. Beds were sometimes shared by workers who slept in shifts depending on their work schedules. You glance around the room again. Even here, the space feels tight. 5 beds fit against the walls with barely enough room for the small table in the centre. Still, the atmosphere feels welcoming. Someone refills your bowl with another serving of soup. The warmth spreads through your body again, easing the lingering chill from the harbour breeze earlier in the day. One of the men begins telling a story about his first attempt to order food in English. He gestures dramatically as he speaks. I wanted eggs, he explains, but I said the wrong word. The table erupts in laughter. Stories like this appear frequently in immigrant memoirs. Language confusion often produced both frustration and humour during the early weeks in America. Simple tasks like buying bread or asking directions could become complicated puzzles. Gradually, however, most immigrants adapted. Children often learned English quickly in school, sometimes becoming translators for their parents within a few years of arrival. Your cousin returns to the table and pulls a folded newspaper from his pocket. He spreads it open under the small lamp. Job advertisements fill the pages. Factory work, dock labour, construction crews seeking strong hands for new building projects across the city. He taps one column with his finger. "This place hires many from our village," he says. The idea comforts you. Familiar faces can ease the transition into a new workplace. Outside the window, the sounds of the neighbourhood continue to soften as night deepens. The elevated train rattles past once more in the distance, its wheels echoing across the rooftops. Somewhere down the street, a violin begins playing a slow melody that drifts upward through the warm summer air. You lean back in your chair, feeling the exhaustion finally settling fully into your muscles. The long journey across the Atlantic feels almost unreal now. The crowded steerage bunks, the anxious hours inside the registry room, the quick examinations by Ellis Island doctors. All of it already feels like part of another life. Some historians suggest that immigrants often experienced this strange emotional shift during their first evening in America. After weeks of anticipation and fear, the quiet reality of daily life arrived almost suddenly. A bed, a meal, a plan for tomorrow. Your cousin folds the newspaper again and places it on the table. "Sleep now," he says gently. "Morning comes early in this city." You nod. The others begin clearing the dishes while you prepare the small bed beside the wall. The mattress is thin, yet after the voyage it feels wonderfully comfortable. You lie down and listen to the city breathing beyond the window. The distant rumble of trains, the fading voices on the street, the quiet footsteps of neighbours moving through the hallway outside the room. Somewhere far beyond the rooftops, Ellis Island rests quietly in the harbour. Tonight you are no longer standing in its inspection lines. Tonight you are simply another new resident of New York City. And tomorrow, the work of building a life in America truly begins. Morning arrives in the boarding house, not with quiet sunlight, but with the layered sounds of a neighbourhood already awake. Before your eyes even open, you hear movement in the hallway outside the room. Footsteps pass along the creaking floorboards. Someone coughs. A door shuts with a hollow thump. Then the street below begins its own morning chorus. Wagons rumble over cobblestones. A vendor shouts about fresh bread. Somewhere down the block, a factory whistle cuts through the air with a long metallic cry that seems to ripple through the entire neighbourhood. You open your eyes slowly. For a moment you forget where you are. The low ceiling above the bed feels unfamiliar. The smell of cooking onions drifts faintly through the thin walls. Then the memory returns. America. Your cousin is already awake, sitting at the small table, pulling on a pair of worn boots. He glances up and nods towards you. "Time to start learning the city," he says. You sit up and stretch carefully. Your body still carries the stiffness of the ocean voyage, though the steady ground beneath the building already feels natural again. The room fills with early morning light filtering through the narrow window. Dust floats gently through the air like tiny drifting specks of gold. One of the other men pours coffee into chipped ceramic cups. The strong smell spreads quickly through the room. Coffee and bread form the entire breakfast. Simple but satisfying. Immigrant boarding houses often followed routines like this. Shared meals allowed residents to keep costs low while still providing enough energy for long working days ahead. You sit at the table and take a cautious sip of coffee. The bitterness makes you blink for a moment, but the warmth helps chase away the lingering sleep. Outside the window, the neighbourhood grows steadily louder. Children hurry towards the school buildings carrying books under their arms. Shopkeepers unlock doors and begin sweeping yesterday's dust from the sidewalks. Factory workers walk in clusters toward nearby workshops, their footsteps quick and purposeful. Observers writing about New York during the early 20th century often remarked on how quickly the city seemed to awaken each morning. The energy of millions of residents created a sense that the streets themselves were alive. Your cousin finishes tying his boots. "We go see the factory today," he says. He gestures toward the folded newspaper still resting on the table from the night before. The advertisement he pointed to remains visible among the crowded columns of text. The job may not be glamorous, but it is a beginning. Many immigrants during this era enter the garment industry as their first American employment. The city housed thousands of clothing workshops where workers stitched shirts, coats and dresses for customers across the country. Government labour reports from the period show how rapidly this industry expanded with the help of immigrant labour. You finish your bread and stand. Soon the two of you step out into the hallway and descend the narrow staircase toward the street. The building creaks gently with every step, its wooden structure carrying the history of countless residents who passed through before you. The front door opens onto the busy sidewalk. Morning sunlight floods the street. You pause for a second, taking in the scene. A vegetable cart rolls past, piled high with cabbage and onions. A woman leans from a second-floor window, shaking crumbs from a tablecloth. A policeman strolls along the corner while adjusting his cap. The city wastes no time beginning its day. Your cousin leads the way down the block. As you walk, he points out small landmarks that help explain the neighbourhood. A bakery that sells the best rye bread on the street. A barber shop where many men from your region gather on Sundays. A small church attended by families from the same province you left behind. Communities like this helped immigrants feel less alone during their first years in America. Shared language and traditions allowed newcomers to build support networks within the enormous city. Yet historians examining these neighbourhoods sometimes disagree about how long such communities remain dominant. Some scholars suggest immigrants gradually moved into more diverse neighbourhoods as they improved their economic situation. Others note that ethnic communities often remained strong for generations. You turn another corner and suddenly the street grows louder. The source becomes obvious immediately. Ahead stands a large brick building with rows of tall windows stretching across several floors. Workers stream through the entrance carrying lunch pails and small bundles of tools. The garment factory. Even from the sidewalk, you can hear the distant clatter of sewing machines inside. The sound resembles a steady mechanical rain. Your cousin stops near the entrance. "This is where I started," he explains. You watch the workers entering the building. Men and women of many different backgrounds pass through the doors. Some speak Italian, others Russian. Several speak English with quick confidence. A supervisor stands near the entrance checking a small notebook as employees arrive. Factories like this one often operated 6 days a week. Workdays commonly lasted 10 or more hours depending on production demands. Conditions could be challenging. Rooms filled with rows of machines often grew hot during summer months, and the constant noise made conversation difficult. Yet many immigrants accepted these hardships willingly because factory wages offered a path towards stability. Your cousin approaches the supervisor and greets him briefly. They exchange a few words in English before the supervisor glances toward you with mild curiosity. Your cousin explains your situation. The supervisor studies you for a moment. Then he nods. "Come tomorrow morning," he says. "We see what you can do." Relief flows through you again. The opportunity is not guaranteed, but it is a door opening slightly. You thank him carefully. As the two of you step away from the factory entrance, the sounds of the machines continue humming inside the building. The rhythm of industry, the rhythm that powers the entire city. Your cousin smiles. "First job almost found," he says. You walk back towards the quieter residential streets, with a new sense of direction forming inside your mind. Only yesterday you stood in the long lines of Ellis Island, wondering whether strangers would allow you to enter this country. Today you are already searching for work in the heart of its busiest city. Life moves quickly here. faster than you ever imagined. And with each passing hour, the strange new world around you begins to feel a little more familiar. You leave the factory street with your cousin, the steady clatter of sewing machines fading behind you as the two of you walk back toward the quieter blocks of the neighbourhood. The morning sun has climbed higher now, casting bright rectangles of light across the brick walls and the uneven stones of the road. Your cousin walks with easy confidence, weaving through pedestrians who seem to move with practiced speed. For them, the city is familiar territory. For you, it still feels like a giant puzzle slowly revealing its pieces. As you walk, he begins pointing out more of the daily life that fills these streets. A corner grocery where barrels of pickles sit outside the door. A small shop selling boots sturdy enough for factory floors. A narrow storefront where a tailor works long hours repairing worn coats brought in by workers who cannot afford new ones. Every few steps another detail appears. You notice how many businesses are run by immigrants themselves. Signs above the doors display names from many different countries. Some are written in English, others in languages that remind you of home. Small businesses like these form the backbone of many immigrant neighbourhoods. New arrivals often relied on shops owned by people who spoke the same language or understood the same customs. This made everyday tasks far easier: buying bread, sending letters, finding someone who could translate a confusing document. Accounts from newcomers often mention how comforting it felt to hear familiar words spoken inside a busy American city. Your cousin stops at a busy intersection where several street vendors have set up carts. One man sells roasted chestnuts, the hot metal pan releasing a warm, smoky aroma. Another offers apples stacked in neat pyramids. A woman nearby ladles soup from a large pot for workers who pause briefly before continuing on their way. Street food became an important part of urban life in immigrant districts. Workers with little time for long meals could grab quick, inexpensive food between shifts or during short breaks. You and your cousin each buy a small roll filled with warm potatoes and onions. The vendor wraps the food in paper before handing it over with a nod. You take a bite. The flavour is simple but satisfying, and the warmth spreads pleasantly through your hands. While you eat, your cousin explains how the neighbourhood changes throughout the day. Morning belongs to workers heading toward factories and shops. Afternoon fills with children returning from school and women shopping for food. Evening brings music, conversation, and sometimes lively gatherings in small cafes or beer halls. Neighbourhood life follows its own rhythm, almost like the tide of the harbour rising and falling. Writers describing immigrant communities at the time often noted how closely neighbours relied on one another. In crowded tenement buildings, people shared news, watched each other's children, and offered help during illness or difficult times. These informal support networks often replaced the extended families immigrants left behind. Still, not everything about neighbourhood life was easy. City housing inspectors, during the early 20th century, frequently documented the overcrowded conditions inside many tenement buildings. Entire families sometimes lived in single rooms, and access to fresh air or proper sanitation could be limited. Efforts to improve housing gradually appeared through new city regulations, though progress moved slowly. Your cousin finishes his roll and gestures toward a narrow park further down the street. A small square of green appears between the buildings. Several benches sit beneath young trees, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. Children chase one another across the grass, while an elderly man reads a newspaper beneath a lamppost. You sit for a moment on one of the benches. The park feels peaceful compared with the busy streets surrounding it. A group of women nearby speak animatedly in Italian while watching their children play. Their voices rise and fall with laughter. One little boy attempts to fly a homemade kite made from cloth and thin wooden sticks. The kite flutters uncertainly above the grass before collapsing again. He tries once more with determined patience. Small parks like this became important gathering spaces in crowded neighbourhoods where many apartments lacked open outdoor areas. They provided fresh air, sunlight, and a place where children could run without dodging wagons or streetcars. You lean back slightly on the bench. Your body still carries the fatigue of travel, but the calm atmosphere of the park allows your thoughts to settle. Across the square, a group of older men sit together playing a quiet card game. Their conversation drifts across the air in a language you recognise instantly. It is the dialect of your own region. You exchange a brief glance with your cousin. He smiles knowingly. You see, he says softly, even here you find home. Moments like this appear often in the recollections of immigrants. Familiar sounds or traditions could suddenly appear in the most unexpected corners of American cities, creating small bridges between the old life and the new. Yet historians continue examining how these cultural ties changed over time. Some evidence suggests that later generations gradually adopted more American customs while still preserving parts of their heritage. Other researchers emphasize how traditions remained remarkably resilient across generations. You watch the children playing in the grass. The boy with the kite finally catches a stronger breeze. The cloth lifts upward for a brief moment, dancing above his head before drifting back down. He cheers loudly. The sound makes several adults smile. Your cousin checks the position of the sun in the sky. "We should go," he says. "Tomorrow we work, today we prepare." You stand from the bench and follow him back toward the busy streets. The city greets you once again with its endless movement. Streetcars rumble along their tracks. Vendors call to passing customers. Factory whistles echo faintly in the distance. Only yesterday you crossed the ocean and faced the anxious lines of Ellis Island. Now you walk through the streets of New York, learning the small patterns of everyday life, step by step, street by street. The enormous city that once seemed overwhelming slowly begins to feel like a place where you might belong. The afternoon slowly drifts toward evening as you and your cousin leave the small park and return to the streets. The sunlight now falls at a lower angle, painting the brick buildings in warmer tones. Windows glow softly where the light touches them, while the narrow alleys between buildings fill with long shadows. You notice that the rhythm of the neighbourhood has shifted again. The morning rush of workers heading to factories has passed. Now the sidewalks belong to shoppers, children, and people returning home after a long day. A woman balances a basket of vegetables on her arm while speaking rapidly with a neighbour. A group of boys kick a worn leather ball between them in the middle of the street, scattering quickly whenever a wagon approaches. Your cousin guides you down another block lined with tall tenement buildings. Their fire escapes zigzag across the brick walls like metal ladders climbing toward the sky. You glance upward. Laundry still hangs between the windows. Shirts, aprons, and bedsheets flutter gently in the evening breeze. The sight repeats itself along the entire street, creating a patchwork of white cloth against dark brick. Housing records from the early 20th century reveal just how densely these buildings were filled. Some tenement apartments measured only a few small rooms, yet housed entire families, along with boarders who rented beds for extra income. Despite the crowded conditions, these buildings form the heart of immigrant community life. Inside those narrow rooms, people cooked familiar meals, wrote letters home, argued about politics from their old countries, and celebrated holidays that reminded them of where they came from. Your cousin stops in front of a fruit stand, where crates of oranges and bananas are stacked neatly along the sidewalk. He picks up 2 apples and hands one to you. The fruit is crisp and refreshing. You take a bite while watching the life of the street unfold around you. Across the road, a man pushes a cart filled with metal pots and pans, calling out his goods in a loud, rhythmic voice. Farther down the block, a barber sweeps hair from his doorway while greeting passers-by. One particularly amusing detail appears in several immigrant recollections from this period. Children growing up in crowded tenements often played games on the fire escapes high above the street. These metal platforms became informal playgrounds where children shared stories, traded toys, and sometimes even practiced small musical instruments while neighbours listened from their windows. You imagine the scene, rows of fire escapes filled with laughter echoing between buildings. It seems almost impossible that such crowded surroundings could produce moments of joy. Yet people have always found ways to create small islands of happiness, even in the busiest environments. Your cousin finishes his apple and tosses the core into a nearby barrel. "We visit the market," he says. You follow him through several twisting streets until the buildings open into a wide market square. Stalls stretch across the open space, each one covered by simple cloth awnings. The market buzzes with voices speaking a dozen different languages. Fishmongers arrange fresh catches on beds of ice. Butchers hang cuts of meat from iron hooks. Farmers from outside the city sell baskets filled with carrots, cabbage and potatoes. Markets like this played an important role in feeding New York's rapidly growing population. Farmers from nearby regions transported fresh produce into the city each morning, supplying neighbourhoods where millions of people depended on daily deliveries of food. You walk slowly between the stalls. The smells are powerful. Fresh herbs, raw fish, warm bread, pickled vegetables. A woman offers samples of cheese from a wooden board while speaking enthusiastically to potential customers. Nearby, a group of men debate the price of onions with dramatic gestures. Your cousin greets several vendors as you pass. It seems he has already built a small network of familiar faces here. Markets often served as social gathering places as much as commercial centres. Neighbours exchanged news, discussed work opportunities, and shared rumours about events happening across the city. Historians studying immigrant communities often highlight these informal networks as crucial tools for survival. Information travelled quickly through conversations in markets, cafes and church gatherings. You stop beside a stall selling fresh bread. The baker slices a loaf and offers a small piece for you to taste. The crust crackles softly when you bite into it. Delicious. Your cousin purchases a loaf along with several onions and a small bag of beans. Tonight's supper is beginning to take shape. While he pays, you notice an elderly man sitting quietly on a stool near the edge of the market. He holds a small violin and plays a slow melody that floats gently above the noise of bargaining voices. People drop coins into a small tin beside his chair as they pass. The music carries a hint of melancholy, as though it remembers places far beyond the city. Immigrant musicians often performed in public markets and street corners during this era. Music offered both entertainment and a connection to cultural traditions carried across the ocean. Yet historians continue discussing how immigrant culture transformed within American cities. Some traditions blended with others, creating entirely new forms of music, food and language. The city itself became a kind of cultural laboratory where ideas from different countries mixed together. You listen to the violin for a moment longer before following your cousin toward the edge of the market. The sky above the buildings has begun to soften into evening colours. Shades of orange and violet stretch across the horizon. Street lamps flicker to life one by one along the sidewalks. You carry the loaf of bread under your arm as you walk back toward the boarding house. The day has been long, yet it feels full in a way that surprises you. Yesterday you stood nervously inside the vast halls of Ellis Island, wondering what the future might hold. Today you walked through neighbourhoods filled with markets, factories and crowded tenements where thousands of immigrants build new lives every day. The city still feels enormous, still confusing, but it no longer feels completely unknown. And with every street you learn, every face you recognise. the strange new world around you slowly begins to feel like home. The evening deepens as you and your cousin return from the market, the loaf of bread tucked beneath your arm and the small bag of beans swinging lightly from his hand. Street lamps now glow along the sidewalks, casting soft circles of yellow light onto the cobblestones. The city does not grow quiet at night. It simply changes its voice. The daytime roar of wagons and factory whistles fades slightly, replaced by music drifting from open doorways, laughter echoing between buildings, and the steady murmur of neighbours speaking across stoops. You reach the boarding house just as several other residents return from their own long days. One man climbs the steps slowly, his shoulders tired from factory work. Another carries a bundle of cloth under his arm, likely extra material he brought home to finish sewing. The door creaks open and warm air flows out from the stairwell, carrying the smell of cooking onions and garlic once again. Inside, the narrow hallway buzzes with activity. Doors stand open along the corridor while residents move in and out, greeting one another in a mixture of languages. Someone hums a tune while climbing the stairs. A baby cries somewhere on the floor above. Your cousin pushes open the door to the room and sets the groceries on the table. Within minutes, the small space fills with the comforting routine of evening. A pot is placed on the stove. Water begins to heat. One of the men slices onions while another breaks the loaf of bread into thick pieces. Simple meals like this were common among immigrant workers. Historical accounts of tenement life frequently mention how food preparation became a shared task in crowded living spaces. Cooking together helped stretch limited ingredients while strengthening the sense of community among people far from home. You help stir the beans as they simmer in the pot. The smell gradually fills the room. Outside the window, the neighbourhood continues its nightly transformation. A pair of young men walk down the street singing softly in Italian. Across the way, a group gathers outside a small cafe where a lantern hangs above the doorway. The city after sunset holds a different kind of energy. Not quieter exactly, but more relaxed. Your cousin pours tea while the others sit around the table waiting for the meal to finish cooking. Conversation flows easily now that everyone has returned from work or errands. One man describes a difficult day at the factory where a sewing machine jammed repeatedly, slowing the entire row of workers. Another talks about a letter he received from his family overseas. Letters played an important role in immigrant life. For many newcomers, they were the only connection to the people left behind across the ocean. Entire evenings were sometimes spent reading these letters aloud to friends who shared the same hometown or language. You listen quietly while the stories pass around the table. Eventually the beans are ready. Bowls are filled. Bread is passed from hand to hand. The meal begins. The food tastes even better after a long day walking through the city. One small observation appears in several immigrant memoirs from this period. Many newcomers remembered their first shared meals in America more vividly than the grand landmarks of the city. After weeks of travel and uncertainty, the simple comfort of hot food among familiar voices created a powerful sense of belonging. You understand that feeling now. While the others eat, someone produces a small accordion from beneath one of the beds. The instrument looks worn but well cared for. He begins playing a lively tune that immediately changes the atmosphere of the room. Feet tap against the floorboards. One of the men claps along with the rhythm while laughing. Music often travelled wherever immigrants gathered. Songs from villages across Europe followed their singers into tenement rooms, cafes, and neighbourhood celebrations. These melodies help preserve cultural traditions, even as life in America slowly reshaped them. Some historians suggest that these musical gatherings strengthened immigrant identity during the difficult early years of adjustment. Others note that American influences gradually blended with old world songs creating new styles unique to the immigrant experience. The accordion tune grows faster. Soon, two of the men stand and attempt a playful dance in the narrow space between the beds. Their steps are clumsy but enthusiastic, and laughter fills the room. For a moment, the worries of work money and crowded housing seem far away. You lean back in your chair smiling. The window beside you stands open, allowing cool evening air to drift inside. From the street below, you hear another musician playing a violin. The notes rise softly through the darkness, weaving together with the accordion music inside the room. The sounds mingle above the rooftops. A quiet orchestra of immigrant life. Your cousin glances toward you with a satisfied expression. You see, he says the city is not only work. He gestures around the room where laughter continues. It is also people. Outside, the sky has grown dark. The lamps along the street glow steadily now, while shadows stretch between the buildings. Far beyond the rooftops, ships continue to arrive in New York Harbour, carrying new travellers across the Atlantic. On Ellis Island, clerks still shuffle paperwork while doctors examine the latest passengers stepping into the registry room. The process never truly stops. Researchers studying immigration records often remark how constant the flow of newcomers remained during these years. Day after day, ships arrive bringing thousands of people searching for opportunity in the growing nation. Some of those travellers will soon find their way into neighbourhoods like this one, perhaps even into this very building. The accordion music slows at last. Dinner plates are cleared. The small room gradually settles into a quieter mood as the long day catches up with everyone. Your cousin begins folding the newspaper again, scanning tomorrow's job listings beneath the dim lamp. You watch the light flicker across the page. Tomorrow you will step into the factory and begin learning the rhythm of work that shapes this entire neighbourhood. But tonight the city feels almost gentle. The voices in the hallway fade. The music on the street softens. And as you prepare for sleep once more in this crowded room above a New York sidewalk, you realise something remarkable. America no longer feels like a distant dream across the ocean. It feels like the life unfolding around you right now. Morning comes again, though this time it feels different. You wake before the factory whistle, your eyes opening slowly as pale sunlight slips through the narrow window beside your bed. The room is quiet for a moment. Several of the men still sleep, their breathing slow and steady after the late evening of music and conversation. Outside, the city has not yet reached its full voice. A cart rolls softly along the street below. Somewhere in the distance, a door closes. A pigeon flutters past the window and settles on the fire escape with a faint rustle of wings. You sit up and stretch. Today is the day you begin work. The thought brings both excitement and a small knot of nervousness to your chest. Your cousin stirs in the next bed and glances over. Good, he murmurs, seeing you awake. Factory soon. The two of you rise quietly so you do not disturb the others. Boots are pulled on. Coats are gathered. The morning routine moves quickly now that you know the rhythm of the building. Soon, the room fills with the smell of coffee once again. Breakfast is simple, just bread and hot drink, but it provides the strength needed for the long hours ahead. Factories in New York during the early 20th century often began work early in the morning. The workday commonly stretched 10 hours or more with only brief pauses for meals. Labour historians examining employment records from this era frequently point out how much the city's booming industries relied on immigrant workers willing to endure these demanding schedules. You finish your coffee and step out into the hallway with your cousin. The boarding house is already stirring. Doors open and close. Voices echo down the narrow corridor. Someone hurries down the staircase while fastening the buttons of a coat. Outside the building, the street is waking rapidly. Workers stream along the sidewalks in steady lines, moving toward factories and workshops. Some carry metal lunch pails, others tuck small bundles of food into their pockets. The factory whistle suddenly blows. The long sound slices through the morning air, echoing across the rooftops like a signal that the entire neighbourhood understands. Your cousin nods toward the street. Time. You walk quickly through the familiar blocks, your pace matching the flow of workers moving in the same direction. The streets feel more organised this morning. Yesterday, everything seemed chaotic and overwhelming. Now you begin to notice patterns. The bakery already sells fresh loaves through its open doorway. The fruit vendor arranges oranges in careful rows. The streetcar rattles past at nearly the same moment it did yesterday. Life here follows schedules shaped by work. As you approach the factory building, the sound of sewing machines already hums faintly through the brick walls. Workers gather near the entrance before filing inside. Your cousin greets a few familiar faces. They nod towards you with friendly curiosity. New arrivals are common in places like this, yet each newcomer still draws brief attention. You step inside. The factory floor spreads across a large room filled with long rows of sewing machines placed close together. Tall windows along the walls allow sunlight to spill across the wooden floors. The noise is immediate. Dozens of machines clatter at once, their needles rising and falling with relentless rhythm. The sound fills the air like heavy rain striking a roof. A supervisor approaches. He remembers you from yesterday and gestures toward an empty machine at the end of one row. You learn here, he says. Your cousin gives a quick nod of encouragement before moving toward his own station farther down the line. You sit carefully at the machine. The metal surface feels cool beneath your hands. A pile of fabric rests on the table beside you. The supervisor demonstrates the basic motion. Guide the cloth beneath the needle. Keep the seam straight. Work quickly but carefully. Then the machine begins. You press the pedal. The needle leaps into motion with surprising speed, punching through the cloth again and again while the thread pulls tight along the seam. At first the motion feels awkward. Your hands move too slowly. The fabric twists slightly beneath the needle. The supervisor adjusts your grip with quick practiced gestures. Like this, he says. Gradually the rhythm becomes easier. You watch the other workers carefully. Their hands move with astonishing speed, guiding cloth through the machines without hesitation. Garment factories, during this period, often divided production into specialized tasks. Each worker performed a single step repeatedly while the garments moved down the line toward completion. This system allowed factories to produce clothing rapidly for the growing national market. It also meant workers repeated the same motions for hours at a time. The noise never truly stops. Needles strike fabric. Belts spin beneath the machines. Voices occasionally rise above the clatter when someone calls for more material. Yet amid the noise, you begin to feel something unexpected. Focus. The steady rhythm of the machine draws your attention completely into the task. Each seam becomes a small accomplishment. Each finished piece moves the growing stack of completed work slightly higher. One curious detail mentioned in factory workers' recollections describes how many employees learn to recognize one another by rhythm rather than voice. Every machine had its own subtle pattern depending on how quickly its operator worked. Experienced workers could often identify a colleague simply by listening to the tempo of the sewing machine across the room. The morning hours pass more quickly than you expected. Eventually a bell rings. Machines slow. Workers stretch their hands and shoulders as the short midday break begins. You lean back from the machine and wipe your hands on a cloth. The factory air smells faintly of fabric dust and machine oil. Sunlight pours through the tall windows, illuminating the long rows of workstations. Your cousin appears beside you with a small smile. "Not bad," he says. You glance at the stack of finished pieces beside your machine. It is not large, but it is a beginning. Researchers studying immigrant labour often note how these early days in American factories marked the true start of many immigrant stories. The journey across the ocean might capture the imagination, but daily work shaped the reality of life in the new country. You take a deep breath and look across the busy factory floor. Only a few days ago, you stood in the inspection lines of Ellis Island, wondering whether strangers would allow you into the country at all. Now you sit among dozens of workers contributing to the vast industrial heartbeat of New York City. The sewing machines begin again. Their rhythm fills the room once more, and with each passing stitch, your new life in America continues to take shape. The sewing machines settle back into their relentless rhythm as the short break ends. Around you, the factory floor awakens once more, dozens of pedals pumping beneath tables, while needles dart through layers of cloth. The sound becomes a steady storm of metal and thread that fills every corner of the room. At first, the noise seems overwhelming, yet after a few minutes, you notice how your mind begins adjusting to it. The clatter fades into the background while your hands focus on guiding the fabric beneath the needle. Your cousin works several rows away, bent forward in quiet concentration. Occasionally he glances up to check on you, offering a small nod when he sees your growing stack of finished seams. The sunlight shifts slowly across the tall windows as the afternoon moves forward. You settle into a rhythm. Lift the fabric, guide the edge, press the pedal, repeat. Industrial production in New York during this period relied on exactly this type of repetition. Garment shops divided labour into small steps so that workers could complete hundreds of pieces each day. Immigration records and labour reports from the early 20th century describe entire districts of Manhattan filled with clothing workshops producing shirts, coats and dresses destined for shops across the country. Many of the workers inside those factories had arrived through Ellis Island only months or even weeks earlier. You pause briefly to stretch your fingers. The work is not physically heavy, but the constant motion requires careful attention. A crooked seam means starting again. A broken thread slows the entire line. Across the room, a supervisor moves quietly between rows, observing the progress of each worker. He rarely speaks unless something goes wrong. Most of the time, the machines speak for everyone. An interesting detail remembered by several factory workers describes how employees develop small personal rituals to survive the long hours. Some quietly hummed songs from their homeland while sewing. Others counted stitches in their heads or imagined stories about the customers who might someday wear the clothes they were helping to create. You catch yourself doing something similar. With each seam, your mind drifts briefly to the streets outside, the market stalls, the violin player, the crowded tenements with laundry dancing between windows. The city seems to pulse beyond these factory walls. A bell rings again. This time the signal means the end of the workday. Machines slow gradually across the room until the great mechanical chorus fades into silence. Workers stretch their shoulders and shake out tired hands. The sudden quiet feels almost startling. Your cousin approaches your station. "First day finished," he says with a grin. You look at the stack of completed pieces beside your machine. It is modest compared with the tall piles produced by experienced workers, yet the supervisor nods approvingly as he passes your table. "You learn fast," he remarks before continuing down the row. Relief spreads through your chest. For now at least, the door to steady work remains open. You and your cousin collect your coats and step outside with the other workers. The air feels fresh after the warmth of the factory floor. Evening sunlight glows along the rooftops, while the streets once again fill with the steady movement of people heading home. Factory whistles echo from other buildings across the district, releasing waves of workers onto the sidewalks. Entire neighbourhoods seem to move according to these whistles during the early 20th century. When the workday ended, thousands of labourers poured into the streets almost simultaneously, transforming the city into a flowing river of tired but determined people. You walk with the crowd for a few blocks. Vendors already wait along the sidewalks, hoping to catch hungry workers on their way home. One man sells hot sausages from a steaming cart. Another offers slices of watermelon stacked on chipped wooden trays. You and your cousin stop briefly to buy 2 cups of sweet lemonade. The cool drink refreshes your throat after the long hours inside the factory. Nearby, a group of workers stands talking animatedly about wages and working conditions. Conversations like this became common in factory districts. Many labourers gradually began discussing ways to improve their hours and safety on the job. Some historians believe these informal street corner discussions helped lay the foundation for labour movements that would grow stronger in later decades. Others emphasise that organising workers from many different languages and cultures presented enormous challenges. The topic remains a lively area of research among scholars studying immigrant labour history. You finish your lemonade and continue walking. The evening air carries the smell of cooking from dozens of apartment windows. Garlic onions and fresh bread blend together into a comforting cloud drifting across the neighbourhood. Children run along the sidewalks while parents call them inside for supper. A newsboy stands on the corner shouting headlines from the evening paper. Life unfolds quickly here, yet it also follows familiar patterns: work, meals, neighbours, sleep. As you reach the boarding house once more, the sky above the rooftops glows deep orange before fading gradually into purple. You climb the stairs beside your cousin, your legs pleasantly tired after the long day. Inside the room, the others have already returned. Someone stirs a pot on the stove. Another reads a letter beneath the lamp. The quiet warmth of the space welcomes you back like an old friend, even though you arrived only yesterday. You sit down at the table and remove your boots. For a moment, you simply listen. The murmur of voices in the hallway, the faint music drifting from a cafe down the street, the distant rumble of trains moving across the elevated tracks. This is the sound of your new world. Some researchers studying immigrant experiences note how quickly newcomers often adapted to the routines of American city life. Within days, the unfamiliar streets began forming recognizable patterns, and strangers slowly became neighbours. You feel that transformation beginning already. Ellis Island now feels like a distant doorway rather than the centre of your story. Beyond the harbour, new ships still arrive every day carrying travellers who will soon stand where you once stood waiting nervously beneath the tall ceiling of the registry room. But tonight, you sit comfortably in a small room high above a busy street. You have work, you have food, you have a place to sleep, and while the city outside remains vast and unpredictable, the small circle of life forming around you grows steadier with each passing day. The days begin to settle into a rhythm that feels both steady and strangely swift. Morning follows night with little pause, and before long you find yourself walking the same streets each day with a growing sense of familiarity. When you leave the boarding house in the early light, the bakery window already glows warm with fresh loaves. The fruit vendor arranges his crates in the same careful pattern. The streetcar rattles past at nearly the same moment, each morning its conductor ringing a small bell as it glides through the intersection. Patterns emerge. The city that once seemed overwhelming now reveals small, predictable habits. You and your cousin walk side by side toward the factory as the neighbourhood wakes around you. Workers gather in loose groups along the sidewalks, some speaking in rapid bursts of Italian or Polish, others practicing English phrases they heard the day before. A man ahead of you repeats the words slowly under his breath. "Good morning, sir." Then again, "Good morning." Learning English becomes an important step for many immigrants, hoping to move beyond the lowest paying factory positions. Evening classes organised by churches and community groups often offered lessons for workers who spent their days in noisy workshops. Accounts from teachers during this period describe classrooms filled with tired labourers who arrived straight from long shifts yet remained determined to learn the language of their new country. You reach the factory doors as the whistle calls workers inside. The machines begin their daily chorus once more. The work grows easier with practice. Your hands move more confidently now, guiding the fabric with less hesitation. The supervisor rarely needs to correct your technique. You begin noticing the personalities around you as well. The man across the aisle hums softly while he works. A young woman 2 rows away stitches at remarkable speed, her stack of finished garments growing twice as fast as anyone else's. Another worker occasionally taps the side of his machine with a small wrench, coaxing the stubborn mechanism back into rhythm. One charming detail remembered by former garment workers tells of how some employees develop silent competitions during the workday. Without speaking a word, 2 workers might race to finish the same number of pieces, each determined to prove their skill through quiet speed alone. You suspect the woman across the aisle might be winning several of those contests. At midday, the bell rings for the short meal break. Workers open small lunch pails and unwrap bread or fruit brought from home. The factory windows stand open now, allowing fresh air to drift through the room along with distant sounds from the street. You sit beside your cousin while eating. Below the window you can see pedestrians moving between shops and street vendors. New York at this time continues expanding at astonishing speed. Population records from the early 20th century show the city growing year by year as immigrants arrived from Europe and migrants moved in from rural parts of the United States. Entire new neighbourhoods appeared almost overnight. Construction crews worked constantly to keep pace with the demand for housing and businesses. You watch a group of children walking home from school across the street. They chatter easily in English, while occasionally slipping into the language their parents speak at home. Researchers studying immigrant families often remark on how quickly children adapted to life in America. Within a few years, many young people spoke English fluently and helped their parents navigate unfamiliar systems like schools, banks, and city offices. This process sometimes created small cultural tensions within families. Parents hoped to preserve traditions from the old country, while their children absorbed new customs from classmates and teachers. The conversation around this subject continues among historians, examining how immigrant identities evolved across generations. The lunch bell rings again. Machines roar back to life. Your hands return to the familiar rhythm of sewing, while the afternoon light gradually shifts across the factory floor. By the end of the day, the stack beside your machine stands noticeably taller than it did during your first shift. You feel a quiet satisfaction. When the final bell sounds, workers stretch their stiff shoulders and gather their belongings before stepping outside into the evening air. The neighbourhood greets you once more with its lively energy. Street musicians perform near the cafe. Shop windows glow beneath hanging lamps. Families stroll slowly along the sidewalks, enjoying the cooler evening breeze. Your cousin suggests taking a slightly longer route home tonight. Show you something, he says. You follow him through several unfamiliar streets until the buildings suddenly open into a wider avenue. The sight before you makes you pause. Electric lights stretch along the street in bright rows, illuminating theatres, restaurants, and large storefront windows filled with fashionable clothing. Crowds move along the sidewalks, laughing and talking, as though the day has only just begun. This part of the city feels different from the crowded immigrant neighbourhood where you live. More polished, more extravagant. Visitors from outside the city often wrote about the dazzling lights of Manhattan's entertainment districts during the early 20th century. Electric lighting had begun transforming nighttime streets into places of activity rather than darkness. Your cousin points toward one of the theatre buildings where a large poster advertises a musical performance. Someday, he says with a grin, we go inside. For now, you simply stand on the edge of the crowd, watching the lights sparkle against the evening sky. The city contains many worlds within it. Factory floors filled with clattering machines. Tenement rooms where families share simple meals. And avenues like this where music and laughter spill from brightly lit theatres. Historians exploring urban life often emphasise how these contrasting environments existed side by side in early 20th century New York. Wealth, poverty, entertainment and labour all mingled within a few miles of crowded streets. You take one last look at the glowing theatre signs before following your cousin back toward the quieter neighbourhood streets. The bright lights fade behind you. The familiar rows of brick buildings return. Soon the boarding house appears once more at the corner of the block. Inside waits another simple meal, another night of rest before tomorrow's work begins. Yet tonight something feels slightly different. You realise that the city no longer feels like a maze you must survive. It feels like a place you are beginning to understand. Step by step, day by day, and far out in the harbour, Ellis Island continues welcoming new arrivals who will soon begin this same journey through the living streets of New York. Another week passes, and before long the rhythm of your life in the city feels almost natural. Each morning you leave the boarding house with the same steady group of workers. Each evening you return along the same streets where shopkeepers recognise your face and greet you with quick nods. The city continues moving quickly around you, but you begin to move with it instead of against it. One evening after work, your cousin suggests walking toward the waterfront. You should see where the ships come, he says. The two of you travel through several busy streets before the air begins to change. The smell of salt and river water replaces the scent of bakeries and crowded markets. The buildings grow lower near the harbour, giving way to long wooden piers stretching out into the dark water. When you reach the edge of the docks, the view opens wide. The harbour spreads before you beneath the fading light of evening. Tugboats glide slowly across the surface, their lanterns reflecting in trembling lines across the water. Larger steamships rest quietly beside the piers, while crews load crates and barrels into their cargo holds. Beyond them, far out in the distance, the faint outline of Ellis Island sits like a small shadow against the horizon. You lean against the railing and watch the harbour. Ships arrive here almost constantly. Shipping schedules from the early 20th century show that New York Harbour remained one of the busiest ports in the world during this period. Steamships carried cargo, passengers and mail across the Atlantic on regular routes linking America with Europe. Many of the people working along these docks were immigrants themselves. Dock labour offered physically demanding work, but it paid better than some factory jobs. Strong workers could earn steady wages unloading cargo from ships that arrived from ports across the globe. Your cousin gestures toward a large vessel slowly approaching the harbour entrance. More people coming, he says. You follow the line of his finger. Even from this distance, you can imagine what the passengers on that ship might be feeling. The same mixture of exhaustion and hope that filled your chest when you first saw the Statue of Liberty rising through the fog. One small story recorded by a harbour worker from this era describes how dock hands sometimes paused their work to watch new immigrant ships arrive. They remembered their own journeys and wondered about the lives waiting ahead for those standing at the rails of the approaching vessels. You remain leaning against the wooden railing while the evening grows darker. The lights of the city begin to sparkle behind you. Electric lamps along the docks glow softly while lanterns swing gently from the rigging of nearby ships. The harbour feels calm tonight. Waves lap quietly against the wooden pilings beneath your feet. Yet, historians studying immigration often remind readers that this calm surface hides countless individual stories. Each arriving ship carried families escaping poverty, political unrest, or limited opportunities in their home countries. Scholars examining passenger records continue exploring how these journeys reshaped both the immigrants and the nation receiving them. The discussion remains rich and ongoing. Your cousin sits on a nearby crate and watches the approaching ship with quiet interest. "You remember your ship?" he asks. You nod. The memory remains vivid. The crowded deck, the first glimpse of the statue, the nervous silence during the ferry ride toward Ellis Island. It already feels both recent and distant at the same time. The approaching steamship releases a low whistle that echoes across the harbour. Dock workers nearby begin preparing ropes and cargo equipment. Even at this hour, the waterfront remains active. Crates of fruit, barrels of flour, and stacks of lumber move constantly between ships and warehouses. Trade never truly stops in a port like this. You watch the lights of Manhattan reflecting across the water. The skyline looks different from here. Factories, offices, and apartment buildings form a jagged silhouette against the darkening sky. Some observers writing about New York during this era often describe the harbour at night as one of the most impressive sights in the world. The combination of electric lights, moving ships, and towering buildings created a scene that seemed almost magical compared with the quieter ports many immigrants had known before. Your cousin stands and stretches. "Come," he says. "Late already." You take one final glance toward the distant outline of Ellis Island. New ferries still cross the water, carrying groups of travellers toward the inspection halls you remember so clearly. Somewhere inside those buildings, new arrivals are answering questions, waiting nervously for the moment when an official nod will allow them to step forward. Soon many of them will stand exactly where you are standing now, watching the harbour, trying to imagine the life unfolding ahead. You and your cousin begin walking back toward the neighbourhood. The city streets feel quieter now as night deepens, though the occasional wagon still passes along the cobblestones. A cafe door opens briefly, releasing laughter and music into the cool air before closing again. When you reach the boarding house, the hallway lights glow softly. Inside the room, several of the men already sleep, while another sits near the lamp reading a letter from home. You remove your boots and sit beside the window. Outside, the city continues breathing quietly beneath the night sky. Your first weeks in America have passed quickly. Work fills your days. Neighbours fill your evenings. And little by little, the unfamiliar streets of New York have begun weaving themselves into the story of your life. Far beyond the rooftops, ships continue crossing the Atlantic. But tonight, you are no longer a passenger searching for a place to belong. You are already part of the city. The weeks continue unfolding one after another, and slowly the city becomes something you navigate with growing confidence. Streets that once felt confusing now reveal shortcuts. Shopkeepers greet you with friendly recognition. Even the sounds of the city begin to feel familiar rather than overwhelming. Morning begins the same way most days. You wake to the murmur of the boarding house stirring to life. Someone coughs in the hallway. Boots thump against the wooden floor. A kettle whistles softly in the small kitchen space down the corridor. Soon the room fills with the scent of coffee and bread. You sit at the table beside your cousin, sipping the hot drink while the window beside you glows pale with early light. Outside, the street slowly wakes. A wagon rattles past. The bakery door opens. Children hurry along the sidewalk carrying books for school. Your cousin folds the morning newspaper and taps the page thoughtfully. "You see this," he says, turning the paper toward you. The article describes a new group of immigrants arriving in New York Harbour the previous day. Ships continue bringing thousands of people each month, all stepping into the same inspection process you experienced not long ago. Passenger records from the period confirm that Ellis Island processed enormous numbers of arrivals during these years. Some days, the registry halls handle several thousand people from dozens of countries. The steady flow shaped entire neighbourhoods across the city. You glance at the newspaper again. It feels strange to think how recently you stood among those new arrivals yourself. Your cousin smiles slightly. "Not so long ago you there," he says. You nod. The memory returns clearly. The ferry rocking gently beside Ellis Island. The echoing ceiling of the registry room. The anxious moment when the inspector asked your questions. Now those memories feel almost like a distant chapter already closing behind you. After breakfast, you walk toward the factory, once again joining the steady line of workers filling the sidewalks. Familiar faces appear in the crowd now. The woman who sells fruit near the corner waves as you pass. The newsboy shouts headlines with the same dramatic enthusiasm every morning. Even the policeman directing traffic seems to recognise many of the regular pedestrians. The factory whistle blows. The day begins. Inside the workshop, the machines resume their constant rhythm. Your hands move confidently now, guiding the fabric beneath the needle without hesitation. The pile of finished work beside your station grows faster with each passing hour. Experience brings speed. Speed brings approval from the supervisor. Workers across the room exchange small smiles during the midday break as they compare their stacks of completed pieces. One recollection, preserved in the writings of former garment workers, tells of how employees sometimes decorated their machines with small personal objects. A photograph from home, a lucky coin tied to the metal frame, a ribbon from a family celebration. These tiny reminders helped workers feel connected to the lives they carried across the ocean. You notice that one man nearby keeps a faded photograph pinned above his machine. A family stands together in the image. Perhaps they still live far away. Perhaps he hopes to bring them here someday. The lunch bell rings. You sit near the open window beside your cousin while eating bread and cheese. Outside the city continues its endless motion. Streetcars rattle past. Vendors call to customers. Workers hurry between buildings. Urban historians studying this era often describe New York as a city of constant arrival and adaptation. New communities formed, expanded, and sometimes shifted to different neighborhoods as immigrants found work and built more stable lives. The process shaped the cultural landscape of the city in ways that remain visible even generations later. When the afternoon shift ends, you leave the factory with tired hands but a steady sense of purpose. Instead of returning directly home, you and your cousin stop at the small park you visited earlier in the week. The benches are filled with families enjoying the cool evening air. Children run across the grass while older men discuss politics or sports in animated conversations. You sit quietly for a moment watching the scene. The boy with the homemade kite appears again, though tonight he has improved his design. The cloth lifts higher this time, dancing briefly above the trees before drifting down again. His laughter echoes across the park. You smile. Life here continues, growing more familiar. Yet historians who examine immigrant experiences often emphasize how quickly fortunes could change during these years. Economic downturns, workplace accidents, or sudden illness could challenge even the most determined newcomers. The uncertainty formed a constant background to immigrant life. Even so, people continue building families, communities, and traditions within the crowded streets. You leave the park as evening settles over the neighbourhood. The market stalls begin closing. Street lamps flicker on. Music drifts from a cafe where several musicians gather around a small table. When you reach the boarding house, the familiar sounds greet you once again. Voices in the hallway, cooking on the stove, someone practicing a slow accordion melody near the window. You sit beside the lamp while your cousin reads the newspaper again. The article about new arrivals still rests on the front page. Tomorrow, those travellers will step into the city just as you did. They will search for work, find crowded rooms, learn the rhythm of factory machines and busy streets, and gradually, they will discover what you have already begun to understand. Life in America rarely begins with grand triumphs. It begins with ordinary days. Work, meals, neighbours, sleep. Then slowly, almost without noticing, those ordinary days build something larger. A new life, a new home, and a new story unfolding within the endless streets of New York. Time moves quietly forward in the city, and before long, the first month of your new life in America begins to settle into memory. The days no longer feel quite as uncertain as they once did. The streets are familiar now. The walk to the factory feels routine. Even the sounds of the sewing machines have become part of the rhythm of your thoughts. One evening, after another long shift, you leave the factory with your cousin and stroll slowly toward the waterfront again. The sky glows soft gold as the sun lowers behind the buildings. Workers spill out of the factories in steady waves, their voices mixing with the rumble of wagons and the distant bells of streetcars. Your hands feel tired, but it is the satisfying kind of tiredness that comes from a full day of work. You pass the small park where children chase each other across the grass. The boy with the kite appears once more, though tonight the wind carries it higher than before. The cloth flutters proudly above the trees while the boy runs beneath it laughing. Your cousin chuckles. "Good wind today," he says. You continue toward the harbour. Soon the buildings open once more into the wide view of the water. Evening spreads across the harbour like a soft blanket, and the first stars begin appearing above the darkening skyline. Ships move slowly through the channel, their lanterns glowing gently against the surface of the water. Far out in the distance, the small outline of Ellis Island rests quietly between the harbour currents. Looking at it now feels different than it did weeks ago. At that time the island seemed enormous, a place of questions and uncertainty where your future waited inside a crowded hall. Now it appears small, just another building among many, yet its importance remains enormous for the countless travellers still arriving every day. Records kept by immigration officials during these years reveal how Ellis Island continued welcoming ships filled with hopeful newcomers throughout the early 20th century. Families arrived carrying bundles of clothing, letters of introduction, and dreams of opportunity in a country that was still expanding rapidly. Some historians view Ellis Island primarily as a gateway that allowed millions of immigrants to begin new lives in America. Others emphasize the tension and scrutiny built into the inspection process, reminding us that each traveller passed through a careful system designed to evaluate their health, character, and ability to support themselves. Both interpretations capture pieces of the experience. Standing here tonight, you remember the nervous silence of that ferry ride across the harbour. You remember the echo of footsteps inside the registry room. You remember the inspector's eyes studying your answers. And you remember the moment when he nodded and waved you forward. A small gesture, yet one that changed everything. A quiet breeze moves across the water now. You lean against the railing and watch the harbour lights shimmer across the surface. Your cousin sits nearby, relaxed after the long day. "You doing well here?" he says. You consider the question carefully. The work is hard. The room at the boarding house is crowded. The city is louder than any place you ever lived before. Yet something inside you feels steady. You have begun building a life. Neighbours greet you in the streets. Your hands grow faster each day at the sewing machine. You know which bakery sells the freshest bread and which street corner fills with music on Saturday evenings. Small details like these slowly transform a strange city into something resembling home. You glance once more toward Ellis Island. From this distance, the island sits peacefully beneath the twilight sky. Ferries move back and forth across the water, their lanterns glowing like tiny drifting stars. Somewhere inside those buildings, new arrivals may be sitting on benches, just as you once did, waiting for their names to be called. Perhaps they feel the same mixture of hope and fear you carried during your first hours in America. You hope their stories unfold well. The night deepens. You and your cousin begin walking back toward the neighbourhood, your footsteps echoing softly along the quiet streets. Windows glow warmly above the sidewalks. Music drifts from a nearby cafe. The smell of supper floats through open doorways, where families gather around tables, much like the one waiting for you back at the boarding house. Life continues. Simple, steady, ordinary. Yet within these ordinary evenings, the great story of immigration quietly unfolds. Millions of people crossed oceans, passed through Ellis Island, and stepped into cities like this one, searching for a better future. Their lives did not always become easy, but they built neighbourhoods, businesses, traditions and families that shaped the nation in lasting ways. And tonight, as you climb the familiar staircase of the boarding house and settle once more into the small room overlooking the street, the city outside seems softer than it once did. The sounds of wagons fade. The music in the distance grows quieter. The lights along the street blur gently as sleep approaches. You lie down and close your eyes. The harbour continues breathing beyond the rooftops. Ships glide slowly through the dark water. And Ellis Island waits patiently for tomorrow's arrivals. For now, though, your journey has carried you beyond its crowded halls. You are no longer the traveller arriving in search of a beginning. You are already living the story. The city grows quiet around you now. The noises of the street soften into distant murmurs, while the night settles gently across the rooftops. Somewhere far away, a train rolls along its track with a low, steady rhythm that fades slowly into the dark. You breathe easily. The long voyage across the Atlantic feels like a dream, drifting farther away with each passing night. The anxious lines inside Ellis Island have softened into memory. What once felt uncertain now rests calmly behind you. Outside the window, the air carries a cool evening breeze. The scent of the harbour moves faintly through the streets, reminding you that ships are still arriving and departing even while most of the city sleeps. Somewhere across the water, new travellers lean against railings on crowded decks, watching the lights of New York appear through the darkness just as you once did. Their stories are just beginning. Yours has already begun to settle into the quiet rhythm of daily life. Work will come again tomorrow. Neighbours will greet one another along the sidewalks. The sewing machines will hum softly inside the factory. Yet tonight there is nothing to do except rest. Your breathing slows. The city outside continues its endless motion, while your thoughts drift peacefully between memory and sleep. And beneath the soft glow of distant harbour lights, the great journey that brought you here gently fades into a calm and quiet dream. Sweet dreams.